Okay, so by my watch, it's just gone 9 a.m. in the UK. So welcome everybody. Welcome to this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are, virtual environmental ergonomics seminar. This is a series that I've been running with Today and Stephen, neither of which are with us today. So I'll be chairing today's session. And this is the second one that we've hosted at this for us at an earlier time, and for quite a lot of you guys at a more reasonable hour. Just to kind of give you a quick heads up, because some of you might be dipping in for the first time. This is actually I think this is the 10th one that we've run. The first three that we ran, the first one was sort of on the theme of isolation, sort of jumping on the bandwagon of the current situation. Where everyone was suddenly having to adapt and to work in the comforts or otherwise of their own home. So we had 3 talks on the idea of isolation, or the very theme of that. Then myself and one of my now former PhD students, we looked at heat adaptation before moving on to heat as a therapeutic intervention. These are all streamed at 4 p.m. UK time, so later than this current one. And but also it's worth pointing out, all of these talks are available for free on the ICEE2021.com website. So if you can't watch them in real time, they are there for subsequent viewing. Following those, we had a look at behavioural and autonomic thermoregulation. Then the first one, or currently the only one to date for today at this time, we had a look at an occupational angle. So we looked at firefighting. Then we looked at pollution. So they were quite heat centric to start with, tried to vary our environments. We looked at pollution following that. And then the last 3 have covered a very interesting athlete, coach, scientist discussion featuring Trent and Evan, and how they prepared using a variety of environmental stressors, and how they prepared for a number of environmental stressors for the World Championships. Then we looked at cold, so the other end of the temperature spectrum. And then last week we had a hypoxic session with a special focus on nitric oxide at these low oxygen concentrations. We've got a number of talks coming up. Obviously, we've got today's, which I'll introduce very shortly. And then we've got another 4 talks after this before we're going to have a little mini break. The next one will be cross-adaptation, so looking at how we might be able to use adaptations to one environmental stressor in another temperature or environmental extreme. Then we're having a look at altitude again, specifically with a nutritional angle. Week after that, we're going to have a little break because it clashes with the Physiological Society's Future Physiology Conference, and that has a heavy theme on environmental physiology. So to try and prevent any conflicts there, we'll be having a brief pause. And then the last session that we've got scheduled in for this current series will be from a multidisciplinary group for covering Japan, America, and the Middle East. Looking at how the IOC were preparing for Tokyo, initially 2020, but obviously now been rescheduled for next year. Most of these are at the more normal time, so they're 7 hours later than this current slot, which for some of you obviously will not be the most convenient time. But like I say, they are all going to be on YouTube almost the same day, so you can wake up and over your coffee the next day you can tune in. The one exception will be the one with the IOC preparation, to try and capture the East Coast of America right through to Japan, where the speakers are coming from. We've had to kind of fudge the time a little bit, and that'll be 4 hours later than this slot. But a range of adaptations. Then we're going to have a brief pause. The view will be to come back about 4 weeks later. Depending on the current situation, we might be decreasing the frequency or changing it slightly, but the idea is to keep this theme going on, and we've already got a number of talks provisionally lined up on themes similar to the ones we've covered, but also space and diving and other environmental extremes. So we've done a few talks, got a few coming up. And this brings us on to the immediate one. So we have two speakers from Australia, hence the earlier slot for myself. We've got Rob Duffield, who's going to be talking about pre-cooling in sports. He's going to go first. And then we're going to listen to Grant Landers from the University of Western Australia, looking at it from a slightly different angle, looking at heat and the cognitive impacts that might have. For those of you that haven't been with us before, the way the webinar works is that you can use the Q&A function. So if you pose a question during the talk, I will ask the speakers on your behalf a couple of those questions at the end of each talk. And then the speakers, if they're able to, can answer any outstanding questions through that type function. So if you can put them in the Q&A rather than the chat function, that would be much appreciated. Okay, so without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will pass you over to Rob, who's going to kick us off on today's session.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate the invitation and appreciate everyone tuning in wherever you are around the world. Hope you're safe and well and surviving the zombie apocalypse as best you can. Chris has asked me and Jeff has asked me to present a little bit on some of the work we've done around pre-cooling, and I'll freely admit in the last couple of years we haven't necessarily done much, so this will be quite a narcissistic self-citation of some of the work we've historically done, just to kind of walk through from both a laboratory and field perspective. I currently probably represent University of Technology Sydney here in Sydney, Australia, and also Football Federation Australia, so there'll be a slight football slant to this as well. So next 20 minutes, as I said, we'll kind of walk through some of the work we've done in and around pre-cooling with a particular focus on the team sport element. Obviously, before we start, understanding why you pre-cool for the environment or for the sport in the environment is critical. So we'll do a quick snapshot of football in the heat before we've done some of the work of pre-cooling for team sports in the lab, then translate that into field environments, and then finish off with some just key considerations about the topic of pre-cooling, and then wrap it up. So we'll start off with just a quick snapshot of football in the heat, because obviously understanding why you use any intervention, cooling or otherwise, to improve performance relies on understanding the changes that are occurring because of that environment or that context. So what happens with football in the heat? And we'll start off just with a nice little study that came a few years ago. Shouldn't say little, because it's quite a big study out of the guys at Qatar, looking at almost an RCT model of playing football in cooler and warmer conditions or hot conditions. And we see, as to be expected, that there's a change in the physical activity patterns and a reduction in the volume and high intensity of the running. Though that kind of reduction is not necessarily always seen in simulated matches, is not actually always seen in real live matches. And the nice, again, work out of Qatar on the World Cup data shows that many of the match characteristics in actual matches don't change. They're quite robust regardless of the environmental conditions. But certainly for any given individual player playing in hotter conditions, the volume of work they do is going to be decreased, and there's an alteration to the pacing strategies. And this is alongside increased physiological and perceptual strain. So obviously, for a reduced work in that crossover RCT match performance, you see increased core temperatures and cardiovascular loads. So they're both synonymous and in conjunction, but it's also alongside altered technical and altered possession-based football. So rather than the increasing the volume of work, you let the ball do the work. There's a change in the type of passing, the regularity of passing, and the success of passing. So I guess it's kind of a clear indication that playing in hotter conditions changes the mechanics and the processes of how people play the game. You see a reduction in work, you see an alteration in pacing. That pacing alteration is very much a maintenance of those high intensity efforts, which are critical for match performance, but decreasing distances and speeds in those lower intensities. This is alongside exacerbated physiological and perceptual responses, altered technical responses. Obviously, there's a potential increased likelihood of heat stress in those higher temperatures, though the data on that in itself is a little bit equivocal, certainly in Australian soccer. But I guess it creates that context of why you'd want to and why there'd be a need to protect performance, if not health, in training or competition for a range of team sports, with, I guess, particular focus here on football. So I guess pre-cooling is one option. It's not the only option. It's one vehicle through which the negative or the fatigue-inducing effects of heat can be countered. Obviously, there are others. Some are more efficient, some are larger, but it's one option. And I guess that concept of pre-cooling sits around in any conditions. Now, there's obviously questions of at what temperature or what environmental conditions should you start to pre-cool, but in reality, anything that's going to promote endogenous heat gain in excess of what would be normal. The traditional view here would be then that there's a reduction in body temperature prior to any exercise, and the traditional or the more historical literature would be using larger interventions, cold rooms, cold showers, cold ice baths for a prolonged period of time. And that research is, existed since the 70s and 80s. It's strong, good research, and it shows pretty clearly that all those thermoregulatory and physiological responses that you expect in terms of reduction of core, skin and muscle temperature, cardiovascular load, improved heat storage and sweat rate, they're all, and if not improved endurance performance, are all classically seen with these kind of interventions. And that's been known for decades now, since probably before the 70s, but certainly the earlier pre-cooling studies in the 80s showed that nicely. I guess for the contemporary view is many of those many of those studies are driven by interventions that are large and cumbersome and logistically not possible in many applied environments. So the contemporary view is then what extent and what cold device is possible to invoke a performance improvement or an improved health response. So, obviously the smaller the better, but then at what stage does that potency or volume or dose effect then be lost? So I guess that's probably where we sort of come into this discussion. And one of our first studies, going back a few years now, was starting to look just at a team sport context, but in a laboratory environment, using that model of, well, team sport is not just a sprint or not just a one-off effort, but it's sprinting, it's sub-maximal, it's pacing strategies, it's free-paced exercise activity. And so we tried this with different cooling models in terms of cold water immersion or ice vests. And we're able to do this because we turned a biomechanics laboratory into a heat chamber. And I often say it's the best use of a biomechanics lab ever, but that's my bias. And the results were quite nice at the time, or still are, in that probably not unexpected. Sprint times over that 60 minutes didn't really change, regardless of the cooling condition beforehand. But what we did see was this improvement in that sub-maximal endurance distance kind of covered, but that occurs between sprints. This is a protocol. It was pretty regimented in sprint, sub-maximal, but we still see that with a larger cooling intervention, we get bigger performance effects from that sub-maximal rather than the speed or sprint work. And this is alongside better physiological responses with lower core temperatures, improved heat storage from the ice bath, better sweat rates or reduced estimated sweat rates from nude mass. And so we see that, an early indication of volume effect, but certainly that the pre-cooling improves or increases the distance covered as a performance marker, with a reduction in the physiological strain for that load. So a nice little outcome there that translates from classic pre-cooling work in endurance activity into more a dynamic team sport, stochastic kind of nature. But one of the comments is often, well, pre-cooling may increase the distance in a team sport, but football or team sports have sprints that really drive the performance outcomes. So a follow-up study that was more looking at the concept of preheating versus pre-cooling, whereby the model was actually, in heat chamber or in cold water baths. So again, not logistically appropriate and without a warm up, which is not really applicable, but translating that directly into a performance and physiological response. Again, we see that pre-cooling certainly improved the pacing, improved distance covered in those sub-maximal intermittent bouts. And there's this kind of a stepwise response here, in that the pre-cooling covered more distance than the control, which covered more distance than the preheating. So that, invoked, or that fatigue invoked by preheating in hot environments is not unexpected. The reverse of that is also true, that when you move from a cool or cooling environment into high speed, high power activity, you get a suppression in that performance. So it's a nice reminder that pre-cooling may improve one aspect of of team sport performance, but it may negate another. So if you move from a pre-cooling of muscles, obviously we know that reduction in muscle temperature, reduces the viscosity or increases viscosity, delays neuromuscular signaling, and reduced power output. And we see that in the sprint times in that first 10 minutes of intermittent sprinting. So again, a reminder that you can reduce the fatigue-inducing effects of heat in one way, but negate it in another way. Regardless of that, again, with the pre-cooling, you get reduced thermoregulatory loads. And we also saw some nice findings of maintenance of the neuromuscular activity in terms of MVC and voluntary activation post-exercise. So increased volume of work for similar physiological or reduced physiological responses from maintenance of voluntary activation. So not to suggest that that's a central aspect, but certainly the maintenance of that recruitment alongside it reduced thermoregulatory strain probably explains those pacing strategies we see with pre-cooling before exercise in the heat. Another common question of pre-cooling was how much, right? So we did a bit of work, and this was driven by a cricket perspective at the time. Young Jeff, or I shouldn't call young anymore, sorry mate, was certainly a major driver of this. And really it was just looking at that stepwise incremental volume of cooling from a head to head and hands to more of a whole body mix method. It looks pretty brutal in the pictures, and every time I look at them and go, how is that logistically appropriate? But it was a real stepwise process of what could you cool to get enough out of. And again, what we see was this almost dose-like response whereby the more the cooling improved that submaximal intermittent sprint performance better. So bigger volumes and better pacing strategies with a higher volume of cooling, yet no real effect on the repeat sprint kind of element. Mind you, in that top figure, you'll notice that the one intervention that didn't really, or that showed the greatest amount of fatigue in repeat sprint was a control condition. Again, we see bigger volume results in better physiological conditions and reduced thermoregulatory strain. So that larger exposure drives a better physiological response, improves the performance outcomes, certainly in that submaximal genre, and we see again maintained MVCs and voluntary activations as well. So bigger volume, better effect. Again, similar concept of duration using that same whole body mix methods of 10 versus 20 minutes. Again, not that 20 minutes is practical in a real life setting, but we see that dose effect whereby longer exposure for a greater volume gets better performance outcomes, certainly in that submaximal genre and domain rather than the high speed sprinting. So same concept, longer exposure, better physiological and thermoregulatory responses, better performance responses, and again, we see maintenance of MVC and voluntary activation as well. So if I can kind of wrap up that little summary, quite a quick summary of pre-cooling in the lab, for that free-paced intermittent sprint exercise as a representative model of team sports, pre-cooling can definitely improve performance. So it's quite useful, quite strong, and quite common, and similar results through multiple different studies, through multiple different researchers. But again, we see that maintenance of the submaximal effort that fits with the classic endurance performance model where performance is improved following pre-cooling that we've known since the 80s. But a reminder also that in team sports, the notion of heating the muscle before the repeated sprint performance is still critical, and you can harm it with pre-cooling. So seeing that increase in the distance covered and from that model of the lab model that we had, it was really a faster running of shuttle running for similar physiological and perceptual responses, particularly through reduced core temperatures, reduced estimated sweat loss, improved perceived heat strain, were all alongside these improved performance outcomes. Again, with maintenance of MVC, not necessarily a prevention and reduction, but certainly not as great a reduction in MVC or voluntary activation as the other conditions where there was no cooling. This doesn't really represent central activation per se, it represents a snapshot of contractile state at that time. So there's a limitation in terms of inferring mechanisms, but it's a nice little addition to that concept of physiological versus perceptual versus central. It also reminds us that there's a key issue here of duration and volume of the dose. All right, so a lot of the stuff we did was maximal exposure for 20 minutes, but is that even feasible in a real football team, real club room, pre-match or pre-training? So I guess that kind of sets us up for the second part, which does pre-cooling work in the field? You know, as great as that data is, does it work in the field? And is it logistically manageable? So that's our nice little transition from the lab to the field, often oversighted and overquoted, but you know, I'll be hypocritical there and use it as well. So we've done a few studies in and around pre-cooling in the field. I guess the one that I'm going to focus on probably represents what most of them find. It was with a professional football team here in Australia, the mighty North Queensland Fury, who unfortunately no longer with us. Rest in peace, Fury. Part of our professional setup here a few years ago. So I guess this was where we kind of settled on as an idea of this mixed method cooling intervention to maximize volume, but without having to use water baths, showers, those kind of things. So we had ice vests, ice towels, and we had just internal consumption of slushies, which were basically frozen sports drinks that we rethawed. And we used this in training and competition. So it was a two-part project. The first part was in training, where we had coach agree to do the same training session in twice, separated by a week. And we were fortunate enough to be able to control that. It was based around maximal aerobic speed training with interval training and small-sided games. And then from real professional matches, we got in, again, a similar randomized controlled trial model with pre-cooling before and at halftime. Performance data basically was physically oriented with GPS. We had basic physiological measures with heart rate, core temperature, estimated sweat rate from just nude mass. So from a results perspective, the training outcomes were not bad. They weren't significantly different, but they were moderate to large effect sizes for this increased volume of distance covered in training, which is pretty good. Like if you're getting 150, 200 meters more in any MAS training session, that's pretty good. And if you're doing it without actually changing peak speeds or number of sprints or movement patterns in certainly small-sided games, that's a pretty successful outcome for a training session. So I guess it showed similar concepts to what we'd seen in the lab, but just probably not as big and not as strong, even though this was a reasonably well-controlled training session. And again, the physiological responses in terms of core temperature and skin temperature were similar to what we saw in the lab, whereby that post-cooling exposure reduction in core and skin temperature existed, but it probably didn't exist for as long, and it was a lot more transient than what we see in the laboratory conditions, and mainly because you can't really control those conditions as well. Again, trends, but not significant for reduced estimated sweat loss based on a body mass change, and similar reduction in perceived strain, thermal strain, and RPE based on those conditions. So pretty similar results to what we see in the laboratory-based studies, but just not as strong, but still useful in a training context. We kind of go further to, I guess, the responses in matches. We probably see the same responses, but in a lot more diminished and a lot more muted response. So match running distance was, there was a trend, a moderate effect to a large effect for increased distance in the second half following cooling and the recooling. But, given any match is going to have 15, 18% variability in GPS data between matches, to say this was cooling induced would be a stretch. And anyone who's trying to tell you it was is probably trying to sell you something. And as yet, I don't have shares in any cooling vests. I probably should have, but I don't. So, while there was this nice trend, it fits with the training data, fits with the lab data. It's probably highly variable to suggest it's just pre-cooling influence in a match context. We also, though, see reduced perceived thermal strain and reduced core temperatures in those moments when the cooling was applied, both pre-match, before the warm-up, and also at halftime. Despite the small amount of time we actually have to cool, there are some decent effects there, though they would likely dissipate pretty quickly once they resume match play. So I guess the theme there was, yes, there were benefits, but the benefits are a lot smaller than we see in a controlled training environment, which are smaller than what we see in an actually controlled lab environment. So I guess there's benefit there, but there's probably also a few other considerations to roll with as we go through. And while my remit here, based on what Chris and Jeff said, was don't get into the mechanisms, although that's probably what everyone wants to get into, you can't go into it without questioning, like, why does pre-cooling work? Because it relates to when and how you use. And it's undeniable that if you have someone in stinking hot conditions and you stick cold substances on the skin or around them, there's going to be a better feeling because we know the heat is a negative context or provides a negative context. So there's definitely a perceptual aspect of providing the cooling and allowing free pace behavior to be then altered. And we know that from quite a few different recent studies, right? So, and that exists here in a pre-cooling concept. Call it a placebo, call it a benefit, it's ergogenic. That said, there's a definitive physiological response, and the meta-analyses around pre-cooling show that there's a strong reduction in core temperatures, skin temperatures, better heat storage, improved cardiovascular load, reduced sweat rate. So, as long as the dose of pre-cooling is sufficient and large enough or long enough, you'll expect those physiological responses and the reduction in that strain. But then there's also this altered pacing, this maintenance of MVC and voluntary activation before and after pre-cooling for exercise in the heat. So whether that's centrally mediated and how that is probably still a great debate over a beer or 10, but certainly that altered pacing with the maintenance of isometric contraction probably speaks to a preservation of the contractile state. So why does pre-cooling work? Well, it makes you feel good. It preserves your physiological state. It maintains elements of skeletal muscle recruitment, and that leads to physical performance. It's not necessarily skill-based. It doesn't necessarily represent scoreboard outcomes, but certainly it promotes that physical load or the ability to perform physically in hot conditions for intermittent sprint sports like football. And I guess another little sub-layer to that, which I won't go into too much because of time, but certainly we know, or we've seen from a few places, and this is from some work we did with the French Institute of Sport triathletes, that the effects of pre-cooling from a performance perspective are diminished following acclimatization. So pre-heat camp for 20K time trial for triathletes, we see this improvement in the pacing strategies and the work done, but then following the heat camp, the pre-cooling had no beneficial effect. Knowing that that heat camp is going to and did promote improvements in heat acclimatization through central cardiovascular functioning, but also it improves perceptual responses to tolerance of heat as well. So it doesn't necessarily prove one or the other, but shows that heat acclimatization probably negates the influence of pre-cooling, and prior exposure does give you that protection effect that is otherwise provided by pre-cooling in an instant. The other one there is, well, the other question is often common is how to pre-cool, what are the methods or options? Once upon a time, it probably was hang my hat on one particular model or method. These days, I'm probably older and don't care as much. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. But certainly, I kind of see a spectrum here of how pre-cooling could be done. On one end, you're going to have the higher potency, which is a bigger volume, bigger dose. And at the other end of that spectrum, you're going to have a lower potency. One end is going to be highly practical, the other is probably less so, and so you've got the classic cryo chambers, cold water immersion, moving down into, and in no particular order, the ice consumption, ice slushy consumption, the convective fans through to vests, and then single small modalities and just basic hydration. At one end of that spectrum, you're going to get large physiologically driven effects. And the other end, you're going to get perceptual. So what you need to do in your environment will depend on your logistics. So I guess my common answer to coaches and sports scientists is there's no right or wrong answer. It's probably what's more effective in your circumstances and what you're prepared to do. So how can you maximize the dose, either by increasing the duration or the volume, but then limit the issues around practicality that stops people from actually doing pre-cooling. We settled there for a while on this mixed method, vest, towel, slushy, but even then that has its limitations if you're not prepared for it. So maximize the dose, minimize the burden is basically where the practical applications part of it falls. And, be prepared is an obvious thing, but is not as common. And I apologize to Sam Chalmers and the gang that did this a while ago. I haven't updated the slide, but a nice little study in a lab on a treadmill, simulating football, looking at a regular simulating a match on a treadmill with a regular normal conditions, 45-minute halves versus cooling periods, which are pretty brief, 3 minutes, which is what you expect, versus extended half time. So really kind of from a policy perspective. And they kind of showed that any break and any exposure can have some perceptual and physiological benefits. And so it's worthwhile being prepared for that, because the reality is you won't get 20, 25, 30 minutes to pre-cool or to recool. So being prepared to provide something in whatever time frame you have is then critical if you know the conditions are going to be demanding from a thermoregulatory perspective. So I guess summarizing, having no idea where I'm at with time, sorry, Chris, but the most obvious statement of the day is that hot, humid environments are going to affect team sport performance. We see that reduction in work. We see the increased physiological and perceptual strain. There's an alteration in tactical approaches, both because of that, but also because of the nature of the team sport play. So on the day, hydration, which I didn't really cover, but that pre and recooling strategies are definitely going to be useful. We know that they can increase the work performed physically and then offset that physiological and perceptual responses that are obviously often negative or more negative in hot conditions. But look, let's be honest, the pre and recooling benefits are tangible, but they're small and they're useful as long as the logistics are not excessive. Our concepts were probably traditional or more common around that, combining smaller methods to get a bigger volume, whether that's vests, towels, slushies, fans, whatever you can do to minimize that disruption to allow normal routines. You know, one of the reasons we chose a vest and a towel and a slushie is we could give it to the player in the room and they could go off, get physio, talk, do normal preparation because they were mobile. And normal preparation is still important. That said, understanding the breaks in play and the heat policies and how you can maximize the use of that versus, you know, using cooling or drinking is very critical. Often when certain football matches are played in hot conditions and coaches talk negatively after the match about the conditions, you could raise the question, well, what did your team do to prepare for it? And, you know, I won't give you the answer because it's normally full of expletives. But certainly we know that the prediction of poor heat responders is difficult. So really the answer is being prepared when you know the conditions are going to be like that. Individualize the cooling needs to the type of player, the places, the conditions, the big running, the big engine players or the less fit players. It's part of a toolkit rather than something that is ever present. And if you're prepared for it, the logistics are not large, then the benefits are tangible and quite useful, even in uncontrolled match conditions that are quite difficult to have these interventions. Look, guys, appreciate you either waking up, not going to bed, or not napping during this if you didn't. But thanks for your attention and happy to share questions, comments, or just tune out as necessary. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. That was a really nice overview of you know a number of interrelated studies. A couple of questions to come in. I'm going to hold one back to the end. I think it'd be quite nice for both of you to address. But one of the comments or questions from Chris T was related to. So obviously you've put the positives of pre-cooling. I kind of am interpreting the question to look at what about the potential negatives of pre-cooling, muscle temperature, and perhaps any detrimental effects to performance.
Yeah.
Would you mind sort of commenting on that side of things?
Yeah, two parts. One is, again, that study, which is kind of why, you know, I don't want to be overly positive about curing all the ills of the world with a cooling vest. So the reminder of that study we did in the lab, whereby because of the nature of isolating the intervention of pre-cooling versus preheating, we moved straight into the actual exercise protocol. Literally got out of a bath, you know, dried down, put shoes on, and then started sprinting. Apart from being stupid enough to have an injury risk, the detrimental aspects of performance were pretty evident in that repeated sprint aspect for the first 8 to 10 minutes. If you pre or recool at half time and cool the major muscle groups for locomotion and then go out onto the pitch, where we know already post half time that 5 to 10 minutes is a common place for scoring goals, and you've got reduced muscle temperature, you're setting yourself up to fail. So it's a great comment. And the reminder is how you pre-cool is probably important as the dose and volume. So there's a well-known story here in Australian football of a team deciding to recool at half time by using cold water baths and coming out and getting smashed in the second or the third quarter, second half. Now, it's a good story to tell around the campfire to warn young kiddies of the dramas of doing things for the first time in a match. But it's also a reminder that combined with that data, that you can have negative consequences. not necessarily from an endurance perspective, but from a repeat sprint, high performance, power aspect that a lot of key performance outcomes are linked to.
Great. Here's a question from Frank Marino. It's always good when a question starts with, here's a crazy question. Frank said, pre-cooling seems to result in similar physiological changes to cold adaptation and the lowering of strain. Are you aware of any data that suggests that individuals that are cold adapted perform better in the heat? So rather than having to intervene, whether they are already adapted?
Yeah, certainly. And two answers to that. One is, yes, Frank, I'm aware of that data because I'm probably sure you told me about that data. And I think the concept is, resetting skin temperature, let's call it thermostat, even though I don't actually know that that is the right word, but resetting the physiological mechanisms around the processes that drive heat dissipation. And if cold exposure is a similar mechanism to, say, heat exposure, so as it makes pre-cooling redundant, absolutely. It's probably a reminder that if theoretically have bigger fitness and bigger, like the classic endurance studies we know where higher endurance capacity, bigger blood volumes offset the effects of the heat. If you can change your thermoregulatory mechanisms and processes through adaptation to cold or adaptation to heat to reset when you sweat, how you sweat, then that's going to be a benefit and probably reduce the need for pre-cooling. How players and athletes get exposure to that, whether it's the heat or the cold enough prior to any given match, is probably another question. And if you can get that exposure so that you don't need pre-cooling, beautiful, makes your life on match day or training day so much easier. If you can't, that's when we see having that toolkit ready is important. But yes, Frank, and yes, anyone else, that that adaptation to environmental conditions to change the way you thermoregulate is definitely beneficial.
Great, and there's a couple more which I'll leave you to type, but just one more which I think might be worth just a very quick comment on, because I wrote the same thing, is how, do you have any tips or recommendations of how to get buy-in to these strategies? Because it's all well and good telling an athlete or a coach that these are optimal, but I mean, very quickly, how have you gone about, or what struggles have you had with getting such buy-in?
The nature of professional sport is you don't trust anyone until you see it and do it for yourself, and pre-cooling is no different. That particular professional team we did that study with that I showed, common story I tell, there was a very high profile player who was at that team who just laughed in our face about it, then had some pretty negative effects of training and playing in the heat, saw the benefits of it from the other players, got on board with it, loved it, moved to another club. And when they came back to play that team in the same hot conditions, was then using pre-cooling. So again, a reminder that you don't do these things in competition unless you're exposing them to do it in training. That's an obvious one. Having evidence to back you up, but then translating that evidence in the language you use through key people in the club, right? So the coach saw that it was an issue, believed it was an issue. Head of strength and conditioning believed that it was an issue. How you operate in that environment, and then tailoring the interventions to suit the people while still maintaining the evidence about the volume and the dose, and then winning people over just with sheer charm and personality. I don't know that there's any other way. Obviously, I failed at that last part, but I was doing pretty well at the other parts.
Excellent. Right, great. I think in the interest of time, I'm hoping that Grant is behind the black screen and hasn't just wandered off. So I will, if you can have a go at answering some of those text questions, Rob, that would be great. And if you stop sharing your screen, and Grant, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Rob. You've obviously covered a fair bit of stuff that I'm going to cover. I'm going to obviously try and look more towards the way that we've gone down the path of looking at the decision-making process with exercise in the heat and how pre-cooling sort of assists. But the first part of this will certainly will cover off some of the stuff that you've covered as well. I must say it's really good to see. I haven't seen you for a little while, and your hair is still as good as the sulphur-crested cocky. So thinking in the heat. So I Obviously, if we talk about movement, we need bones, muscles, the neural system, and then comes from the central nervous system as well, and we need our energy source. And then before we even start to think about, well, how does the body respond in the heat, we understand that how the body is affected by exercise. So obviously, as soon as we start exercising, we see an increase in breathing, heart rate, temperature, and sweat. So we breathe more to obviously deliver oxygen to the working muscles to allow for that energy production. Heart rate goes up, obviously, to deliver more blood to deliver more oxygen to those working muscles also. But it's also important for that temperature regulation component. Body temperature goes up with exercise because we're not overly efficient in terms of changing that energy directly from the chemical energy into that movement. And so we produce a fair bit of heat. This is obviously great for maintaining body temperature at 37 while at rest, but can start to become a bit of an issue when we're exercising. So obviously understanding how we maintain our body temperature is really important. So the typical ways that we'd typically talk about: conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. But then we start to think about the other behavioural parts. So we're slowing down. So we might reduce the amount of effort we put in. We might think about the environment that we're actually competing in. We might consider our nutrition or the clothing that we're wearing. So in part of that, as obviously with the evaporation component, we're sweating. So there's an increase in sweat rate as we start to exercise to assist with that temperature regulation. So then the next part is then if we've got this additional environmental stress. And so what happens when we add that external heat? And we know that there's, with the external load, whether that's directly from a heat source or whether it's from heat and humidity or the combination of the two, we're potentially going to see that core temperature rising more rapidly. We start to really see that competition for blood flow. So there's that blood wanting to go to the skin to try and assist with the cooling of the body, maintaining that core temp. But obviously during exercise, we want to still deliver that blood to the working muscles. There's always that challenge too, that there's that blood needing to go to the brain to ensure that we're making good decisions while we're exercising. So there's all those that competition for that blood. And quite often, if we get to a certain point, then we start to see a reduction in performance. So where does that performance reduce? Now I've got some arbitrary numbers here, and obviously if we read a lot of work, there's going to be some stuff that says decision making generally drops at around 38.5 and physical performance at about 39.5 degrees. Now these are obviously going to be very different depending on, as Rob mentioned towards the end, in terms of the athletes you're working with versus the general population. So there's going to be an individual point where we might start to see some variations. There's plenty of research, some recent stuff looking at even our best athletes are winning medals when their core temperatures are well over 40, 41 degrees. So it will be quite individual with that. But if we use that as a bit of a guide, that typically decision-making is usually impaired prior to the physical performance. And so if we want to try and improve decision-making, there potentially will be an improvement in physical performance at the same time. So in those hot environments, in those challenging environments, we're still trying to exercise. How can we improve performance? So we look at obviously adaptation, and whether that be through acclimation, whether it be through training, as I've mentioned before, so clothing and nutrition. So although we're not going to talk too much about the acclimation, just it's really important. Rob mentioned it briefly, just in terms of the importance of things like preparing an athlete for these environments. And we know that typically an acclimation process of 5 to 14 days is going to get some physiological changes, which then lead to improved performance in exercise in the heat. This is obviously, in most cases, our best option. And if we've got the ability to do that, then we'll go down that path. But we don't always have that opportunity. Sometimes the environment changes dramatically. If we're coming out of a winter season into the summer, and we have to perform and the day is hot or humid, then we have to adapt. And if we haven't had the heat acclimation process in the last 2 weeks, then we might struggle with that. Or if we have to travel overseas and can't afford, if we're working with age group type athletes who don't have the time to acclimate, then how can we assist them in their preparation or for their performance? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the nutrition side. So in terms of how we improve performance in the heat and using ice ingestion as that. But for me, what's required is obviously the awesome team that you put together to try and to look at these things. So for the next little bit, I'm just going to sort of take you on a bit of a journey with some of the guys that sort of I've worked with over the last 10 or 15 years, where we've looked at this sort of question around improving performance in the heat. So this is Pete Peeling, and unfortunately he's a lot less hair now than the Rotto Cocker, but he certainly was one of the first guys that we did some work together with triathlon and heat, and then we did a project where he was initially working at the Institute of Sport and was working with the Kookaburras, the Australian hockey team, leading into Beijing. And at that time, they were really looking at this ice ingestion component. So rather than just deliver it to the athletes, they were loving it. They thought it was making them perform better. We decided we better have a look at it in the lab and see what we could actually measure. So with that, obviously, there's a whole host. And so I'm going to go through some of the work that the students that have been part of the team for the last 10, 15 years and some of the work they've done and how we've sort of changed the way we've thought or where we've headed with the work we've done. So obviously with pre-cooling, as Rob indicated earlier, a decrease in body temp prior to exercise improves the time to reach that critical body temperature for the individual, and therefore there's that improved performance. And as we know, there's evidence of that from many, many years. So Sharm was the first student that Pete and I work with, and unfortunately he was meant to talk this afternoon as well, but was unavailable. The afternoon for us. And this is where we really looked at what was involved with ice ingestion. So we did a little pre-study first, just to sort of get an idea of how can we reduce that core temp by about 0.5 degree to 1 degree, thereabouts. And from that, we found that about 6.8 to 7 grams of ice per kilogram of body mass consumed in about 30 minutes would see that reduction in core temperature with no change in skin temperature. And like Rob mentioned earlier, when we're talking about sporting performance, sometimes we want to look at a way that we can potentially hydrate an athlete, get them to still be able to move around, do things without being in an ice tub, without cooling the muscles. So potentially maintaining skin temperature and therefore maybe muscle temperature might be quite beneficial. So this is where our thoughts went, and we went with ice. We went with quite solid ice, not a slushy as such. Obviously with the greater the size of the ice cube, then we have to have that phase change occurring from solid to liquid. And so that'll still occur at 0 degrees. And so we can actually take or absorb more heat, more energy with that phase change. So Sharm's project looked at a 40K time trial in the heat, and it was about 33 degrees and 50% humidity. So quite challenging. And here we've just got the changes in core temperature. And as we can see, we had a warm-up period, but we've seen a significant decrease in core temperature in the pre-cooling. It's still significantly lower during the warm-up and stayed lower through the first third of that time trial. And with that, we saw that was a massive bit of data for us. It was that cool. We've seen the change with ice ingestion, and we saw nearly a 6-minute improvement over a 40K time trial. And the athlete said, thermal sensation was lower, RPE, it felt easier, and a significant improvement in performance. So that was just endurance performance. And as Rob mentioned earlier, we know that there's always a lot of support for pre-cooling and endurance-based performance. So then Matt Zimmerman got quite interested in this sort of stuff as well. And we sort of went down the path of looking at, well, what about team sports? And this is sort of happening about the same time as Rob's first study that he put up. And so we actually used female athletes in this study. And we want to see, will we get the same benefits with pre-cooling with that ice ingestion protocol? And so we had a repeated sprint protocol, and it would have been fairly similar to what Rob used. And with that, again, yep, cool. We saw a reduction in core temperature with our ice ingestion condition, and we saw that that stayed lower throughout the first half, and most of the second half, we still maintained that lower body temperature throughout, which was really cool. However, there was, like Rob indicated, no increase in work done or power output. So the sprint efforts weren't any different. So we've got a little bit more work completed in the endurance component, in the active recovery component, so that endurance base is still there. However, the absolute sprint work wasn't impacted by the heat. So there's enough recovery in between sprints for athletes to maintain. So the heat didn't actually have the impact, and therefore the ice ingestion or the pre-cooling protocol didn't have any issues. So we then Matt went and had a look at, okay, well, let's have a look at when sweat rate, and he started looking at steady state exercise. We moved away from team sport for a while, and with the ice ingestion, we were seeing that there was this 5 to 10, 15 minutes potentially where sweat rate was a lot less following ice ingestion. So not only have we hydrated through ice ingestion, we've obviously hydrated through our control in a lab-based experiment, but we're hydrating and we're reducing core temp, and with that the body's responded and hasn't needed to sweat as profusely as early. So that was quite interesting there. He then went on and looked at the heat acclimation versus ice ingestion. And I mean, one of the studies Rob put up said, okay, yep, we've seen some, we've done a heat acclimation protocol, and then we've come and we've tried to do it with ice ingestion afterwards. We've done a test afterwards, and there's been no additional benefit by adding ice on top of heat acclimation. What we wanted to look at with this was going, okay, well, that's great, but if we didn't have the opportunity to heat acclimate, would we still get the same benefits from heat acclimation versus the ice ingestion? So this is looking at the improvements. So this is the heat acclimation condition, and the amount of work they did pre and post, or the time it took them to do the time trial. So this is a 30K time trial equivalent, and they've seen an improvement after the heat acclimation. The second group did a similar amount of training, but not done in the heat acclimation protocol. They just did an ice ingestion prior to their second time trial, and again saw a similar improvement between the two. So it was really cool to see that ice ingestion had a similar impact. So if we didn't have the ability to go and undertake a 2-week heat acclimation protocol, we could still get some similar outcomes in that team sport and in that endurance-based environment. But this is where we started to think about the decision making. And now obviously there's a lot of events, and as I said, so this event, there's events where we go from coming out of winter and performing at the start of the summer season, and we haven't necessarily prepared ourselves well. And so Rob would know this event quite well, having been a 3-time winner. But we need decision making as well as the athletic performance is really, really important. And so what we started to think of was how do we change, or how do we improve our decision making? Because we do know that exercise in the heat will also see a reduction in decision making or cognitive performance. So Jacinta Saldaris said, okay, well, let's start looking at this. And so her thesis really looked at this pre-cooling and improving decision-making in the heat. And so we started off at a fairly simplistic, let's just do a choice reaction task throughout a 30K time trial. And again, we're looking at about 35 degrees and 50 or 60% humidity in most of her studies. So choice reaction, in this case, in this study, was only 5 options. So finger on the button, and then move in time when the colours changed and go to the right spot. We obviously saw with the pre-cooling, again, we're seeing a significant reduction in core temperature versus our control, and that stays lower for the first 15 or 20 minutes within that time trial. Like in Ashan's work, we saw a significant improvement. So in that 30K time trial, we're seeing 7 to 8% improvement in power output. So again, the ice ingestions had a significant endurance effect. What we were surprised at though was that we saw both conditions actually improve their choice reaction time across the two conditions and across time. Now, that wasn't something we expected initially, because we were thinking, okay, well, if we're cooling them, then potentially they're going to make decisions more rapidly because they're not influenced by the heat. So that made us think, well, what is it? So why was there no change in choice reaction time? Why was there this trend actually for choice reaction time to improve? So maybe the task was too simple. Maybe we're not actually putting enough cognitive load. Maybe the athletes are prioritising the task importance. So although they were doing a 30K time trial, when the time came to actually do these choice reaction tasks, they were able to shift their thought process and go, this is their most important component right now, and I'm going to put all my mental ability into that to ensure that I'm actually going to achieve the task that you're asking me to do. So then we thought, well, let's try and remove the time trial component. Let's create a workload that's going to get them hopefully warm enough and challenge them enough, but will improve the complexity from 5 to 8 choices. So we completed the next one, but there's still no difference in cognitive performance. Okay, so there's still choice reaction time didn't change from the first study to the second one. But what we measured this time though was the forehead temperature. And so this hadn't really been done much before. So there'd been a little bit of, let's measure a bit of skin temperature here and there, but not very often had been done around the head. So for us to do this and actually see the significant reduction in forehead temperature during the pre-cooling period, and not only that it was cooler after pre-cooling, but it actually maintained for another 15 or 20 minutes as well, just like the core temperature. So it was great to see that forehead temperature, and this is measuring on the outside, so it's on the skin, but there's no external cooling, and we're in a hot environment. And this point here, we're in the climate chamber at 35 degrees. So there's a hot environment putting heat onto the skin. That's why there's obviously an increase, but it's still significantly lower. And so the cooling there is coming from the internal part and maintaining the cooler skin surface. So then what next? So we thought, well, we've beaten around the bush with these simple choice reaction tasks. We really need to increase the complexity of this task and really look at other aspects of cognitive performance rather than just the simple tasks. And we upped the workload a little bit more again. Still a constant workload, 65% VO2 peak, but we looked at working memory and executive control. So we had a serial sevens task, so counting backwards in sevens from a random number, and we had a colour multi confusion task where they had to try and pick out numbers and colours. As I said, we maintain this choice reaction task just to ensure that as we change the other complexities or we change the workload, that we were still getting a similar response within that choice reaction task, and that the simple tasks were still unaffected by what we were doing. So again, we saw the forehead temperature reduce, which was great. This time, when we increased the complexity of the task, so in our serial sevens task, our working memory task, we saw, as we went through the task, we saw in our control group, so no pre-cooling, that they started to make more and more errors, which is what we'd expected. We expect when we're in a hot environment and as we get hotter and we start to create some stress in the body, that our decision-making is going to start to be a bit poorer. So what was really exciting here was that not only was that actually occurring, which we finally managed to find a task that was challenging enough, but in the group that, or in the condition where the athletes consumed the ice prior, so they pre-cooled the body, they were able to maintain their cognitive ability. So it didn't improve, there was no improvement in cognitive ability, and that's what we don't expect them to become better. But the whole bit there was that maintenance of their cognitive ability, their ability to use their working memory and to maintain their senses to make the correct decisions. So that was really, really awesome. We found that working memory is probably one of those areas that is affected quite a lot by the heat, and therefore is quite beneficial using the pre-cooling technique of ice ingestion. So while this is going on, we started looking at some other stuff. So some external pre-cooling type activities and looking at how that impacted on working memory. So So Shaquila, who's only just started, so she's looking at using sort of cooling cap and a few other bits and pieces there. And then Tessa Moroney, who looked at using a cooling glove and a cooling vest. So using that external cooling as opposed to the internal cooling. And both of them looked at, obviously, prior to exercise and heat, so a pre-cooling environment. Shaquila was looking at steady state exercise and Tessa was more repeat sprint, so more sort of cycling criterion-based activity. In both cases, there was no change in working memory. So still, maybe it is about the core temperature. Maybe it really, because neither of these two processes really had a massive impact on core temperature. So maybe it is about the core temperature and then potentially the internal temperature of the brain, or the reduction in the temperature of the blood potentially, which is having this impact. Because each of these studies prior, there's always been, when we've had this ice ingestion pre-cooling, there's always been the perception from the athletes, the participants, that I feel better. So perceived exertion is lower and thermal sensation is lower. So they feel better. So it's always coming back to this question of why are we seeing some improvements? Is it a placebo effect? Because it's very hard. You can't hide the fact that they're ingesting ice. And as Rob mentioned towards the end of his talk, as we feel better, potentially we're going to perform better. So at the same time, there's a lot of menthol research going on, and I think Russ is on tonight too, listening. So and so he's done a fair bit of work around menthol at the same time. So it was starting to get interesting that maybe there's this menthol is showing that we've got improvements in physical performance, and we're starting to challenge our ideas around pre-cooling and the thought processes. And is it a perceptual thing, or is it really a physiological thing? So we want to sort of challenge that. So towards the end, Jacinta said, well, let's actually have a look, and let's pre-cool and let's add menthol, and let's have a look at how cognitive performance is impacted, but also the time to fatigue. So we'll still leave a physical performance component in there. So we'll see if menthol has an impact on that and whether that can improve performance, which everyone's saying it does, and the research is suggesting it. But will it also, is it perceptually, if I feel better, I feel cooler, will I perform better as well from a cognitive perspective? So as would expect, the time to fatigue task, so after 90 minutes of running, they completed a time to fatigue task at, I think, 110% VO2 max. And the menthol group and the mixed group was menthol plus ice ingestion as a pre-cooling at the start, both improved time to fatigue. So in both these two groups here, the purple and the blue, both groups had menthol prior to the time to fatigue task, whereas in the control group, nothing had happened and performance was much less. So menthol works with that. Forehead temperature, we had to obviously just make sure that was the same. So again, so if we pre-cooled, so we had the mixed method, we had the ice ingestion during the pre-cooling period, we're seeing a reduction in forehead temperature. Fantastic. In the menthol group only and the control group only, we're seeing that there's no change in forehead temperature prior to exercise. These dips each time at the end of the 30-minute period. So at the end of 30 minutes of running is when they completed their next cognitive task. So as they've stopped running, obviously the forehead temperature reduces slightly, increase again and then reduce. So it's only different maybe for the first 20 minutes forehead temperature, but still again, it's a significant difference for that time period. And here we're looking at the cognitive performance and the response there. So in this case here, we've seen, if we look at the executive processes, we're seeing a significant improvements in those, in the mixed method component. But we're not, sorry, I've got my colours back to front here. So we're seeing a significant improvement in our pre-cooling plus menthol group compared to our control. However, with our menthol only group, there's no improvement, no significant improvement. And there's a trend towards the serial 7s again, towards the end of that exercise where the cognitive performance starts to improve. So at the moment, we're sort of moving towards not just in the athlete world, and we're starting to look at industry and and within in a surgery perspective. Obviously, with burn surgery, quite often surgery is conducted in a hotter environment, and so working with those medical staff that are in that environment for multiple hours. So if we're looking at why this is effective, so ice ingestion, I think I've slipped my slides wrong, but around the wrong way, sorry. So ice ingestion improved both cognitive performance and time to fatigue. From that previous study, and menthol improved time to fatigue only. So ice ingestion, the benefits, obviously, that's it can be done quite in a short period. There's a decrease in body temp of about 0.5 to 1 degree. And that'll depend whether it's more of an ice slushy or crushed ice itself. We know that there's certainly endurance performance and the decision making. So if we think that decision making, so the next step with this is that going, okay, well, let's see, how does this apply? And this is where Rob sort of talks about the importance within the team sport. So although I might be able to maintain my sprint speed, so I can get to the ball in the same time, but if I can make a decision, if I can process the information I've got, so my working memory and my executive decision making is improved, then I can decide to turn and change direction and get to the ball before the other person. So I'm already half a second in front. So although my physical performance may not improve, if my decision making can improve in that team sport environment, it'll certainly improve my outcome. So as I mentioned before, so why is ice or eating ice so effective? Obviously the phase change from ice into water, there's lots of energy can be absorbed. There's potential for that hydration component. There's no change in that muscle temperature. There's a decrease in head temperature, and quite often we do have that I feel better. So although we're seeing that athletes are saying I feel better, and there's potential that the cognitive component, the perceptual component, we also are seeing that there may be some physiological improvements to improve the cognitive side as well. So I'll stop talking there. I feel like I was talking rather quickly. As much as practice I've had doing these online lectures in the last little while, it's still quite challenging when you can't actually see your audience. So if you've got any questions, more than happy to answer.
Thanks, Grant. Yeah, a few questions have come in. So I guess I'll start with one from Danielle Adams. So we dabbled on some cognitive stuff as well, and this is linked more, I guess, to the methodological considerations. So in your studies, how familiar were the participants already with these sorts of activities and tasks in these conditions? Because we know that it quite often is quite a big learning effect in some of these cognitive tests.
Yeah. So with all the cognitive tasks themselves, obviously the typical familiarization that occurs, and we'd set limits in that they need to have achieved it minimal variation before that we were ready for them to actually start the testing process. So within the familiarization, they would have done the test 10 or so times in one block, and then we're usually by the last 2 or 3 they're all pretty similar, and then we would break, we'd do some other stuff, we'd come back and we'd do. So they'd probably not do about 50 or 60 trials in that familiarization period for only say 5 tests within the testing protocol itself.
Cool. And then there's a question from Ian White, which is coming out from the opposite angle, I guess. But what he said is, showing good improvements in cognitive function. Are you aware of any data that that you can train cognitive function in the heat? So kind of actually looking for that familiarization now. Like, do you know if people can train for that specifically in the heat? We haven't gone down the path of looking at that, but I think from us, the next part that we would like to see is the heat acclimation process and how that then may have the impact, so that we're not having to worry about the pre-cooling side, and whether that heat acclimation obviously has the physiological benefits, but whether that can also assist with the decision-making process as well. So like any task though, I think if we were to challenge them in the heat over time, just as they can improve, and it's a lot about the resource load that they have. So if they learn to, or have the ability to maintain their physical performance, then they're going to have more ability to put effort into that cognitive task. So I certainly think if they're
training cognitively in the heat, that they're going to certainly see an improvement in that performance over time too.
Cool. A bit of a sort of a slightly more mechanistic one, I guess, related to the reduction in forehead temperature. So, a question here, anonymous question. Did you measure skin temperature elsewhere? If so, how did that respond? And just to sort of blur the question asked a little bit, but just sort of what do you think might explain the reduction in forehead temperature? What's your proposed mechanism, I guess?
So that is a really good question, because it was certainly for us from a publication point of view, one that we were challenged quite a bit with that, because initially there's a couple of swine studies looking at ice ingestion and been able to measure it in a number of invasive ways. When we're working with humans, not quite as easy. And one of the suggestions was almost to put a thermometer and drill it, almost stick it into someone's ear, which is great, but quite challenging in an exercise environment. When you actually are trying to assess their cognitive ability, you don't want to create those distractors. So with the background of the understanding of those studies that have done more invasive type work, which had used a forehead measurement as well, seemed the most logical way to assess it. What we have noticed is with the other skin temperatures that we've measured in the past, and it's only now that we're sort of reflecting on those sort of things, because typically use those skin temperatures as a component of total body temperature, and so it's usually grouped and you don't look at them individually. But what we've sort of noticed as we go back is potentially those skin temperatures that are measured closer to where the ice is ingested is probably more responsive to that. So there's that conductive component of that ice. So the ice being in the mouth itself, there's going to be that conductive component where it's cooling that area around the face straight away. There's obviously that discussion around whether it's cooling the blood and therefore that's passing through the mouth and then going up as well, possibly. But yeah, so areas of the sternum is probably more responsive in skin temperature versus the skin temperatures on the calf. So it is certainly a little bit related to the localization of that ice.
Cool. Another quick one just for you is, do you have any data looking at the duration of benefit? So how long you might get a benefit following a pre-cooling intervention on cognitive performance?
So this is, we've sort of, there's a few bits to this. So the one part was, well, even just thinking about this idea of is it a perceptual thing or is it a performance component? And we're seeing typically that 20 to 25 minutes of reduced core temperature after ice ingestion. So we just had a group of third year students look at it last year, was just say, let's just have ice ingestion and sit in the climate chamber and see how long it takes versus going in there and doing the exercise. And great, we saw a core temperature stayed lower for about an hour versus say 25 minutes. So it took a while, even though we're in a hot environment, it took a while for that core temperature to rise. So what was the second part of that question? But ask that again. I got a bit distracted.
It was just looking at the longevity of any benefit.
Yeah. So at the moment, our longest task from a cognitive perspective has been, we've only exercised for 30 minutes. For 90 minutes. So we've done some stuff where it's been continuous for 60. We've done some bits where they're sort of 30-minute blocks for an hour and a half, and still seen some benefits towards the end. And so from a mechanistic perspective, it's still quite challenging to sort of explain why some of those benefits are lasting for such a long time, because all those other physiological measures, the temperature, the forehead temperature, heart rates, all those sorts of things, they're not usually much different towards the end. But if we look at, and especially in some of the endurance-based performance work, quite often the benefits of that pre-cooling has been in the second half of that endurance exercise. So whether you're creating some reserve, which is based from the physiological perspective, and therefore that's translating to the second half, not too sure. So it is, we're still seeing some results which are in that sort of 60 to 90 minutes, but the typical data that sits around it to support that isn't there at the moment.
Right. I mean, I guess that's, yeah, it's one of those things. The absence of data doesn't mean the data is not there. It just might mean
That's
that, like you said, in a human model, we might not better measure the right thing.
That's right.
Robbie, are you there? Yes, cool. Okay, so just one last question that came in right at the start, and I just thought it'd be nice to pose to both of you, just to kind of a little take-home snapshot, which would be looking at heat acclimation and pre-cooling as two strategies. What would be your take-home message on practicality and effectiveness, and kind of, I guess, the application or the use of either or both? I don't know if Rob, maybe if you want to kick off, as to give Grant's vocal cords a little bit of a breather.
Dulcet tones. Why would you stop? Good question. And there's been a few questions on there around when do you pre-cool, being like what sort of environmental threshold, a WBGT, a radiant heat source, whatever the case is. And it kind of blends into that concept of when do you need to pre-cool is based on your prior exposure, your acclimatization status, and your, probably body type, level of fitness, demands on you. So they're all kind of packaged up into the decision of when you pre-cool. If you have the ability to undergo acclimatization or even acclimation, then do it, right? Because we know the evidence, regardless of what the mechanism is, the evidence is pretty strong that in hot conditions, acclimatization really drives the maintenance, if not improvement in performance. That's cool. Do it. If you can't get that, say in a football environment where there's travel, playing in different places, or in team sports where you have no ability in your home environment to get that acclimatization before you travel to a hot environment, then pre-cooling is the obvious thing to lean on, as well as hydration strategies. At what temperature then, or what WBGT you're required to do it, that'll depend on if you're in the middle of winter somewhere, then, at 24, 25 degrees with direct radiant sunlight is likely to be a place to start considering pre-cooling, even though normally you wouldn't say that is a, challenging thermoregulatory environment. So yes to acclimatization, yes to prior exposure to build that physiological basis, the neuromuscular recruitment maintenance, and the perception of the heat doesn't scare me, because the first thing that you get out in the heat and it's stinking hot, you go, this is crap, all right? And it doesn't matter how strong athlete you are, you have that internal monologue, and it's overcoming that with familiarity. And if you can't, then pre-cooling adds to that, or it prevents, those negative behavioral aspects. So that's where I kind of sequence of, you do the big things, and if you can't do them, you do the smaller things. If you can't do them, you do the smallest things.
Right. And Grant, Rob's probably stolen most of your answer, but if you have anything to add.
Oh, look, man, Rob knows this stuff better than anyone, but genius. Certainly going through all those processes, acclimate first, use these as a secondary measure, and like you said, the discussion sort of around the idea of multiple exposures, etc., and the information it'd be really interesting to see how that evolves over time as well. So we obviously want to allow our athletes to trial these things, but whether too many exposures is going to have a negative impact, we don't know properly at the moment, depending on what type of pre-cooling we actually utilise. But there may be, if we're looking at ice ingestion too, there may be GI issues with some people. So very rare. Quite often, one of the ones that we have seen is the need to urinate following ice ingestion. So if that's an issue, and depending on the activity you're doing, then again, so that familiarisation with the protocols is certainly important.
Excellent. And in the chat function, you'll be able to see that Lars Nybo's just put a couple of links to some related papers. So if anyone wants to copy and paste them before they disappear, please do. Excellent. Well, thanks, guys. That was a great session, nicely interwoven, and hopefully those of you that perhaps can't get to see these live because of the time zone normally, you've enjoyed it as well. As I say, we've got a couple coming up. So next week, which is going to revert back to the less Australian friendly time, I'm afraid, we'll have one on cross adaptation. So one of the questions was looking at perhaps the interventions in different climates. So we're looking at whether perhaps adaptation to one particular condition might be beneficial in another. Then altitude, then that pause, and then the last one of this current series will be looking at how large working groups might start to plan for events that we know are going to compromise optimal performance. Most of those will be at the later or earlier, depending where you are, time, but will obviously be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So what I'll do is just thank everyone for attending, thank both speakers, and hope to see some of you at some of the subsequent seminars.